Did you know long before being arrested for refusing to give up her seat on a bus to a white man, Rosa Parks had protested segregation through her daily activities? She refused to drink out of the drinking fountains labeled "coloreds only." When possible, she refused to ride in segregated elevators and walked up the stairs instead. The origins of the movement. The African American Civil Rights Movement began after Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus to a white man. An organized boycott of the bus system was just the beginning, as African Americans demanded equal rights. In 1896, the Supreme Court had declared segregation legal in Plessy v. Ferguson. This ruling had established a separate but equal doctrine, making laws segregating African Americans legal as long as equal facilities were provided. Jim Crow laws segregating African Americans and whites were common in the South after the Plessy v. Ferguson decision. In places without segregation laws, such as in the North, there was de facto segregation, segregation by custom and tradition. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, had supported court cases trying to overturn segregation since 1909. It provided financial support and lawyers to African Americans. African Americans gained political power as they migrated to northern cities where they could vote. African Americans voted for politicians who listened to their concerns on civil rights issues, resulting in a strong Democratic Party. In Chicago in 1942, the Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, was founded. CORE used sit-ins as a form of protest against segregation and discrimination. In 1943, CORE used sit-ins to protest segregation in restaurants. These sit-ins resulted in the integration of many restaurants, theaters, and other public facilities in Chicago, Detroit, Denver, and Syracuse. The Civil Rights Movement begins. When African Americans returned from World War II, they had hoped for equality. When this did not occur, the Civil Rights Movement began as African Americans planned protests and marches to end prejudice. African American attorney and chief counsel for the NAACP, Thurgood Marshall, worked to end segregation in public schools. In 1954, several Supreme Court cases regarding segregation, including the case of Linda Brown, were combined in one ruling. The girl had been denied admission to her neighborhood school in Topeka, Kansas, because she was African American. In the Supreme Court case, Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas, the court ruled that segregation in public schools was unconstitutional and violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Brown versus the Board of Education convinced African Americans to challenge all forms of segregation, but it also angered many white Southerners who supported segregation. On the day Rosa Parks appeared in court, the Women's Political Council led African Americans in a boycott against the Montgomery bus system. The Montgomery Improvement Association was created to run the boycott and negotiate with city leaders to end segregation. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., elected to head the organization, called for a nonviolent passive resistance approach to end segregation and racism. The boycott of the bus system continued for over a year as African Americans walked or participated in carpools. In December 1956, the United States Supreme Court declared Alabama's laws requiring segregation on buses to be unconstitutional. African American churches. African American churches played a key role in the success of the boycott. Churches became a place for forums, planning meetings, and organizing volunteers for civil rights campaigns. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC, led by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., challenged the segregation of public transportation, housing, at the voting booths, and in public accommodations. Eisenhower and civil rights. President Eisenhower became the first president since Reconstruction to send federal troops into the South to protect African Americans and their constitutional rights. In Little Rock, Arkansas, the governor ordered the Arkansas National Guard to prevent African American students from entering the Little Rock High School. President Eisenhower demanded that the troops be removed. The governor withdrew the troops, but left the school to the angry mob. 2 African American reporters were beaten and many windows of the school were broken. Eisenhower ordered the United States Army to surround the school, and the students were escorted into the building. The troops remained for the entire school year. The Civil Rights Act of 1957 was created to protect the right of African Americans to vote. It marked an important first step in bringing the federal government into the civil rights debate. Did you know in 1964, Martin Luther King Jr., at the age of 35, was the youngest person ever to receive the Nobel Peace Prize for his work towards civil rights? Students like Jesse Jackson from North Carolina Agricultural and Technical College felt that sit-ins gave them the power to change things. SNCC. As sit-ins became more popular, it was necessary to choose a leader to coordinate the effort. Ella Baker, executive director of the SCLC, urged students to create their own organization. The students formed the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. Early leaders were Marion Barry and John Lewis. Robert Moses, a SNCC volunteer from New York, pointed out that most of the civil rights movement was focused on urban areas, and rural African Americans needed help as well. When they went south, SNCC volunteers had their lives threatened and others were beaten. In 1964, 3 SNCC workers were murdered as they tried to register African Americans to vote. SNCC organizer Fannie Lou Hamer was arrested in Mississippi after encouraging African Americans to vote. While in jail, she was beaten by the police. Later, she helped organize the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. She challenged the legality of the segregated Democratic Party at the 1964 Democratic National Convention. The Freedom Riders. In 1961, Corps leader James Farmer asked teams of African Americans and white Americans to travel into the South to integrate bus terminals. The teams became known as Freedom Riders. Violence erupted in several Alabama cities, making national news and shocking many Americans. President John F. Kennedy was compelled to control the violence. John F. Kennedy and civil rights. During John F. Kennedy's presidential campaign in 1960, he supported the civil rights movement, which resulted in African American votes that helped him narrowly win the race. Once in office, President Kennedy became cautious on civil rights, realizing that in order to get other programs passed through Congress, he would have to avoid new civil rights legislation. President Kennedy had his brother Robert F. Kennedy of the Justice Department actively support the civil rights movement. Robert Kennedy helped African Americans register to vote by having lawsuits filed throughout the South. When violence broke out in Montgomery, Alabama, the Kennedy brothers urged the Freedom Riders to stop for a cooling-off period. A deal was struck between Kennedy and Senator James Eastland of Mississippi. The senator stopped the violence, and Kennedy agreed not to object if the Mississippi police arrested the Freedom Riders. The Corps used all their funds to bail the riders out of jail, which threatened the future rides. Thurgood Marshall offered the use of the NAACP's Legal Defense Fund, and the rides began again. President Kennedy ordered the Interstate Commerce Commission to increase regulations against segregation at bus terminals. By 1962, segregation on interstate travel had ended. In 1962, James Meredith, an African-American Air Force veteran, tried to register at the segregated University of Mississippi. Meredith was met with a governor blocking his path. President Kennedy ordered 500 federal marshals to escort Meredith to the campus. A full-scale riot broke out, with 160 marshals being wounded. The Army sent in thousands of troops. For the remainder of the year, Meredith attended classes under federal guard until he graduated the following August. Martin Luther King Jr. was frustrated with the civil rights movement. As the Cuban Missile Crisis escalated, foreign policy became the main priority at the White House. King agreed to hold demonstrations in Alabama knowing they might end in violence, but feeling that they were the only way to get the president's attention. King was jailed, and after his release, the protests began again. The televised events were seen by the nation. Kennedy ordered his aides to prepare a civil rights bill. The Civil Rights Act of 1964. After Alabama Governor George Wallace blocked the way for 2 African Americans to register for college, President Kennedy appeared on national television to announce his civil rights bill. Martin Luther King Jr. wanted to pressure Congress to get Kennedy's civil rights bill through. On August 28, 1963, he led 200,000 demonstrators of all races to the nation's capital and staged a peaceful rally. Opponents of the Civil Rights Bill did whatever they could to slow the procedure to pass it. The bill could easily pass in the House of Representatives, but it faced difficulty in the Senate. Senators could speak for as long as they wanted while debating a bill. A filibuster occurs when a small group of senators takes turns speaking and refuse to stop the debate to allow the bill to be voted on. Today, a filibuster can be stopped if at least 3/5 of the senators, 60 senators, vote for cloture, a motion which cuts off debate and forces a vote. In 1960, a cloture had to be 2/3 or 67 senators. The minority of senators opposed to the bill could easily prevent it from passing into law. After Kennedy's assassination, President Johnson committed himself to getting Kennedy's program, including the Civil Rights Bill, through Congress. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 gave the federal government broad power to stop racial discrimination and segregation in public places, to bring lawsuits to end school segregation, and to require employers to end discrimination in the workplace. The struggle for voting rights. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 did little to guarantee the right to vote. Many African American voters were attacked, beaten, and killed. Many others faced poll taxes. Bombs exploded in many African American businesses and churches. Martin Luther King Jr. decided it was time for another protest to protect African American voting rights. The protest was staged for Selma, Alabama, where African Americans were the majority of the population, while only 3% were registered to vote. Their march for freedom began in Selma and headed toward the state capitol in Montgomery. Sheriff Jim Clark ordered 200 state troopers and deputized citizens to rush the peaceful demonstrators. The brutal attack became known as Bloody Sunday, and the nation saw the images on television. On August 3, 1965, the House of Representatives passed the voting bill, with the Senate passing the bill the following day. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 gave the Attorney General the right to send federal examiners to register qualified voters, bypassing the local officials who often refused to register African Americans. This resulted in 250,000 new African American voters and an increase in African American elected officials in the South. Did you know Kwanzaa, a 7-day celebration of African American culture, was first developed in 1966 in the United States by Maulana Karenga? This holiday was developed in reaction to the 1965 riots in a Los Angeles neighborhood of Watts. Karenga hoped that Kwanzaa, which begins on December 26th, would replace anger and rage with black pride. Problems facing urban African Americans. Even after the passage of civil rights laws in the 1950s and 1960s, racism or prejudice or discrimination towards someone because of their race was common. The civil rights movement had resulted in many positive gains for African Americans, but their economic and social problems were much more difficult to address. Race riots broke out in many American cities between 1965 and 1968. A race riot in Watts, a neighborhood in Los Angeles, lasted 6 days. The worst of the riots occurred in Detroit, where the United States Army was forced to send in tanks and soldiers with machine guns to gain control.
Six days of rioting in a Negro section of Los Angeles left behind scenes reminiscent of war-torn cities. More than 100 square blocks were decimated by fire and looters, and few buildings were left intact. Firemen were harassed by snipers and brick-throwing hoodlums as they attempted to control the fires, many of which were left to burn themselves out. As the National Guard moved in to restore comparative calm, the losses by fire alone were put at $200 million. No attempt has yet been made to estimate the losses suffered at the hands of the looters who stole everything from liquor to playpens. Firemen were later issued flak suits of bulletproof mesh to protect them from snipers who continued to shoot from rooftops. Nearly 3,000 were arrested, and authorities had to open abandoned jails to house those netted by the police. It took the appearance of 14,000 troops to bring an end to what both Negro and white leaders called insurrection by hoodlums. Civil rights leaders were quick to deplore the unbridled lawlessness, and Martin Luther King vowed to do all in his power to prevent a recurrence in Los Angeles or anywhere. An uneasy calm prevails in what is known as the Watts area.
The Kerner Commission was created to make recommendations that would prevent further urban riots. It concluded that the problem was white society and white racism. The commission suggested the creation of 2 million new jobs in inner cities and 6 million new units of public housing. However, with the massive spending in the Vietnam War, President Johnson never endorsed the recommendation. The shift to economic rights. By the mid-1960s, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was criticized for his nonviolent strategy because it had failed to improve the economic condition of African Americans. As a result, he began focusing on economic issues affecting African Americans. The Chicago movement was an effort to call attention to the deplorable housing conditions that many African Americans faced. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his wife moved into a slum apartment in an African American neighborhood in Chicago. Dr. King led a march through the white suburb of Marquette Park to demonstrate the need for open housing. Mayor Richard Daley had police protect the marchers, and Daley met with King to propose a new program to clean up slums. Black Power. After 1965, many African Americans began to turn away from the nonviolent teachings of Dr. King. They sought new strategies, which included self-defense and the idea that African Americans should live free from the presence of whites. Young African Americans called for Black Power, a term that had many different meanings. To some, it meant physical self-defense and violence. For others, including SNCC leader Stokely Carmichael, it meant that they should control the social, political, and economic direction of their struggle for equality. Black Power stressed pride in the African American culture and opposed cultural assimilation, or the philosophy of incorporating different racial or cultural groups into the dominant society. These ideas were popular in poor urban neighborhoods, although Dr. King and many African American leaders were critical of Black Power. In the early 1960s, Malcolm X had become a symbol of the Black Power movement. Malcolm X was a member of the Nation of Islam, known as the Black Muslims, who believed that African Americans should separate themselves from whites and form their own self-governing communities. Malcolm X later broke with the Nation of Islam and began to believe an integrated society was possible. In 1965, 3 members of the Nation of Islam shot and killed Malcolm X. He would be remembered for his view that although African Americans had been victims in the past, they did not have to allow racism to victimize them now. The formation of the Black Panthers was a result of a new generation of militant African American leaders preaching Black Power, Black nationalism, and economic self-sufficiency. The group believed that a revolution was necessary to gain equal rights. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. By the late 1960s, the civil rights movement had fragmented into many competing organizations. The result was no further legislation to help African Americans. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated by a sniper on April 4, 1968, creating national mourning as well as riots in more than 100 cities. In the aftermath of King's death, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1968, which contained a fair housing provision.